Today's lesson is called Black Lives Matter Protests Erupt Across U.S. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff.
My name is Roger, and today we're going to talk about something that was happening in the United States recently. You may have heard the news about the Black Lives Matter movement. There were protests all over the United States, and they came out quite quickly, and they were all over the place. So we're using the word erupt here, which is a word that describes what happens when a volcano explodes. It erupts. Lots of lava comes out of it, and so it's rather sudden, it's rather violent. So here, these protests have happened all over the U.S.
There you go. These protests, they have erupted. Sometimes they've even turned into riots. But the idea here is we're using forceful language to illustrate the fact that these protests, they were forceful too. Forceful protests, forceful language. And the idea behind these protests, I can't disagree with them. Black lives matter. Sometimes people do forget that in the United States, especially people in the police in certain places in the United States. So people are fed up and they started protesting. These protests erupted and it all came back to a single incident. There have been many incidents before, but the incident we'll be talking about after our break here really incited these current protests and riots. And we'll talk about that soon. For now, let's take a short break.
Black Lives Matter protests erupt across U.S. Protests against racial injustice broke out across the United States in late May following the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man who died during an arrest in the city of Minneapolis. A video of the arrest shows an officer with his knee on Floyd's neck as Floyd cried, "I can't breathe." Other officers were looking on.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 erupt， 这个字是动词，指爆发、突然发生、火山喷发。例如 Violence erupted during the election， 选举期间发生暴力事件。或是 The volcano erupted, forcing villagers to flee， 因为火山爆发，迫使村民必须逃离。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指突然冒出。我们可以说 A rash erupted on the patient's back， 该病患的背上突然冒出红疹。再来，我们看到名词 murder， 意思是谋杀案。例如 The police closed the park after they found out a murder had taken place there。 警方在发现一起谋杀案之后关闭公园。另外，这个字也可以当动词，指谋杀、杀害，像是The book is about a girl trying to find out who murdered her father. 那本书是讲一个女孩试着找出谁谋杀了她的父亲。
Okay, so we're talking about protests, which is an activity in which people come out and voice their opinions on something. Usually it means they're not happy about something. You might have protests here in Taiwan against the lack of the pension money for ex-government employees. That caused lots of protests to occur a couple of years ago. But in the United States, we had some protests involving the Black Lives Matter movement, and they erupted all across the U.S. I should mention that protest here is the noun form. It can also be a verb, and a lot of people would say protest as the verb, but in America we tend to pronounce both the verb and the noun the same way. I protest what you did to me.
Anyways, let's begin. The first sentence of our lesson says, protests against racial injustice broke out across the United States in late May following the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man who died during an arrest in the city of Minneapolis. So earlier I said that there was one event that led to these protests, and here it is. This particular event was the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was an unarmed person who died during an arrest in the city of Minneapolis. And a lot of people think that he died because he was black. And yes, people thought that this was an instance of racial injustice. When you're talking about your race, you're talking about where you come from as far as your ethnic background is concerned. In the United States, there are white people, black people, Asian people. You would call these races. And in the United States, there is a long history of racial injustice, especially when it comes to African Americans. If you are of this race in the United States, okay, your life is going to be difficult compared to people of other races, especially white people. So people think, people have forgotten that black people are there and that their lives matter too. Okay, that's the case in America. So they're saying Black Lives Matter.
Indeed, and so this is all about racial injustice. And if something breaks out, of course, it happens rather suddenly in a large scale. Maybe an epidemic or a pandemic can break out and spread all over the place rather quickly. So yes, the disease broke out, or even a prisoner can break out from jail. But in this particular case, these protests broke out. They suddenly started happening in the USA in late May. And these protests, of course, were begun, or at least they followed, the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man who died during an arrest in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, one of the Twin Cities up there. Murder is when one person kills another person, and that's what happened there. George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. I believe he kept his leg on his neck for a very long time.
8 minutes and 46 seconds.
A really long time. It was unnecessary. This was a totally unnecessary death, and the protests were justified here, I believe, in any case. He was unarmed. He did not have any weapon. He was of no danger. There was no reason for them to have done that. So the people being upset by that is completely understandable.
I agree. It's totally understandable. Further, this is not the first time that something like this has happened to a black person in America. Yes, George Floyd was murdered by the police, and everything surrounding this particular crime, it just doesn't make sense. It's not clear why George Floyd had to die, why he had to be pinned to the ground for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Get this, there's actually a video where you can see what happened to poor George Floyd. A video of the arrest shows an officer with his knee on Floyd's neck as Floyd cried, "I can't breathe." Okay, and after a while, George actually did succumb to whatever this police officer was doing. George ended up dying. So this is just catastrophic and a very big avoidable tragedy.
Yep, and that phrase, "I can't breathe," became part of the protest as well. And other officers, other police officers were there, and they looked on. They were looking on, and they weren't really doing anything. They should have realized that something was wrong about that situation, and they should have stopped it from happening, but they didn't. And that's probably what made these protesters even more angry, that all these people just kind of ganged up on George Floyd. Okay, let's move on now to the next paragraph. We'll listen to it first and continue talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, which erupted across the U.S. earlier this year.
Both black and white demonstrators protested police brutality in more than 2,000 U.S. cities, despite the pandemic and social distancing rules. They were supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been fighting racial injustice for many years. Most of the protests were peaceful, but in the first week, violence broke out. More than 17,000 National Guard troops in more than 24 states were called in to try to reinstate order.
第二部分我们看到一个单字 reinstate， 这个字是动词，指使恢复原状，使复职。举例来说， The soccer team reinstated Neil as manager just 7 months after he had left the club. Neil 离开那支足球队才7个月，球队又重聘他为经理了。
Okay, Black Lives Matter. Okay, many protests where people were chanting this and also "I can't breathe." They erupted across the United States and around the world in late May of this particular year. And yes, for a while there, people were very upset with the police and the way that they had handled the George Floyd situation and other similar situations from the past. So yes, people, they started protesting. These protests erupted with great force. Now, both black and white demonstrators or protesters, both black and white demonstrators protested police brutality in more than 2,000 U.S. cities despite the pandemic and social distancing rules. Yes, forget the pandemic for now. Forget social distancing. We need to get out there and demonstrate. We can't let this atrocity against George Floyd stand.
Yep, and of course this happened despite the pandemic. This happened even though this pandemic was going on. People should not be coming out in large groups, or at least being so close together, when a nasty disease could easily spread around as a result. But in any case, these protests took place or happened in about 2,000 cities in the USA. I think some of them actually took place in other countries, and I think there was actually a demonstration here in Taipei as well. And, of course, these things happened despite the pandemic and social distancing, which were all supposed to follow because of the pandemic involving COVID-19. Now, they were supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been fighting racial injustice for many years. And Black Lives Matter seems to have come into the news recently, but this movement and this organization behind it, this movement, has been around actually for quite some time.
Now, most of the protests were peaceful, but in the first week, violence broke out. Yes, there was a lot of emotion. People were very angry. So these protests, sometimes they turned into riots. Yeah, when a protest becomes violent and things get out of hand, you call that a riot. But yes, for the most part, these protests were peaceful. But that first week, yes, there was some violence. Some violence broke out. Anyways, the next sentence says, more than 17,000 National Guard troops in more than 24 states were called in to try to reinstate order. So order apparently kind of went out the window there, and the National Guard had to be called in. They had to put things back into order there, put things back under the control of the authorities there. They had to reinstate order.
Yep, the National Guard, that's a group of soldiers in the United States that work in the country, and I guess they're actually Army reserves. I knew a couple of guys back in my hometown who were in the Guard, or the National Guard. They just had to go to some weekend meetings every other month or something like that, but they could get called into action if there was, say, a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever, or, as in this case, riots. So the National Guard were called in 24 states. Called in, that just means someone in the government said, hey, we need these soldiers to come out, so you guys come out and go to that place and help out.
There you go. All right, folks, with that, it's time for us to take a short break. But when we come back, we will be wrapping up our article on the Black Lives Matter protests.
After the nearly month-long protests, the police officer who had his knee on Floyd's neck was charged with second-degree murder. Across the United States, statues and monuments of historical U.S. leaders whose policies are viewed as racist have been removed. In addition, both the federal government and police departments across the country have taken steps to hold police officers more accountable for their actions.
第三部分我们看到名词 monument 指纪念碑、纪念馆，例如 Max planned to see the most important monuments in Paris. Max 打算去看巴黎最重要的纪念碑。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指历史遗迹，像是 We visited the major monuments when we went to London. 我们去伦敦时参观了重要的历史遗迹。再补充一个相关片语 a monument to 加名词，表示某事物永恒的纪念。举例来说 The university named its library after the famous general as a monument to him. 这所大学以知名将军的名字来为其图书馆命名，作为其永恒的纪念。接下来我们看到单字 federal 这个字是形容词， 指联邦的、联邦制的。我们可以说 It is against federal law in the U.S. to smoke on an airplane. 在美国飞机上抽烟会违反联邦法律。最后我们看到片语 hold somebody accountable or responsible for something, 表示要某人为点点点负责。例如 Even people in power should be held accountable for their actions. 即使是掌权者也应该对自己的行为负起责任。
Okay, let's talk about the final part of our lesson for today. After the nearly month-long protests, the police officer who had his knee on Floyd's neck was charged with second-degree murder. So these protests went on for almost a month. It says the nearly month-long protests, which means they were almost a month long, not quite. And after that time, or after all those protests, the police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck was actually charged with second-degree murder. Now, that's a switch. Usually the police officers are just kind of given a slap on the hand and say, oh, don't do that again. It causes trouble. But actually this time he was charged with second-degree murder, although I'm sure lots of people thought that it should have been first-degree murder.
Well, one way or another, something happened. In the past, when people died like George Floyd did, nothing would happen. The police officers would get off pretty much scot-free. But here, something is happening. The police officer who killed George Floyd, he has been charged with second-degree murder. Now, there's more. Across the United States, statues and monuments of historical U.S. leaders whose policies are viewed as racist have been removed. Yes, there's a very big movement right now to remove some of these statues for Civil War heroes. Yeah, the Confederacy, the South, lost the Civil War, but in the 50s and 60s and the 20th century there, people in southern states started putting up these statues of old Confederate leaders. The Confederacy lost, but people are tired of these statues and they're tearing them down. They are removing these statues and monuments as well.
A statue is just an image of a person, so it would be a statue of these Confederate officers like Robert E. Lee and other people like that. And also we've got monuments, which are probably not statues of people, but they're some kind of sculpture or some kind of shape that commemorates a certain event. I think there's a monument down in central Taipei for the 228 incident. And so in this particular case across the U.S., lots of these statues and monuments were viewed as racist and they had been removed. Sometimes people put paint on them and sprayed graffiti on them and stuff like that, or pushed them down. These were statues and monuments that were viewed as racist. Yes, anything in the Confederacy would probably be conceived as racist because the Confederacy wanted to continue with slavery. And that's bad. You shouldn't do that, and you shouldn't celebrate a country or a movement for wanting to do that.
Yeah, and they lost the Civil War. The Confederacy lost the Civil War in the 1860s, and maybe 100 years later or so, they started putting up these monuments. You lost the war. These people aren't heroes. They were racists. Why are these things up? We got to tear them down. That's what the protesters were thinking, and that's what they did. Anyways, yes, a lot of these have been removed, these racist statues and monuments, and in addition, both the federal government and police departments across the country have taken steps to hold police officers more accountable for their actions. So no longer will you get a slap on the wrist. You will be punished. You will be held accountable for your actions.
Yep, the federal government, of course, is the government of the United States itself. But as you know, there are local governments in the states, and then you've got police departments in individual counties and individual cities or towns, okay? And these various police departments and the federal government, or at least the federal police, the federal government, they've taken steps to hold those police officers accountable. So here, to take steps just means to try to do something one step at a time. Maybe your school is taking steps to reduce bullying in your school, and here they want these police officers, the bad police officers, to be accountable, to be held responsible. So that's the phrase here, to be held accountable or held responsible. That just means you're saying that they are guilty of doing that and they should be punished for it.
There you go. All right, folks, with that, it is time for us to take a break, but don't worry, don't fret. The Chinese teacher is on her way.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分提到，今年5月下旬，全美各地爆发了抗议种族不公不义的游行。那么文中用到一个片语是 break out， 它是指突然发生、爆发。那么 break out 通常是指不愉快的事突然发生，像是爆发战争啊、爆发争执、爆发流行病或是突然失火等等的。我们把 break out 交换位置，把它合成一个单字变成 outbreak。Outbreak 是当名词用，那就表示爆发或是突然发生。好，那我们这边再补充一下 break out 有其他的意思跟用法。第一种呢，我们可以用 break out 来表达疹子啊、痘痘或者是汗等等突然冒出来。我们常常会用 break out 加上 in 再加症状，那么通常是皮肤方面的症状，像是 hives 荨麻疹、pimples 粉刺、a rash 疹子、a sweat 一身汗等等。举例来说 He broke out in a rash all over his body， 他全身起疹子了。好，那么第二个我们可以用 break out 来表达逃脱、越狱，那么后面常常会搭配介系词 of， 我们可以用 break out of 加上名词来表达说逃离某处啊，逃离某个处境。像你可以说 break out of the jail 就是逃狱， break out of poverty 就是脱离贫困。好，那么课文最后写到说，联邦政府和全国各地的警局都采取行动，要警察对自己的行为承担更多责任。课文是用 take steps 来表达采取行动，那么 step 它当名词有一步、脚步或是步伐的意思，引申表达做事情过程中的这个步骤啊或是阶段。那么 take steps 它可以用来表达采取步骤、采取行动、采取措施。之后你可以接不定词或者是接 toward 再加名词或动名词。那我们这边顺便补充2个跟 step 有关的片语。第一个是 out of step， 它可以用来指实际上的步伐或是走向跟人家不一致。那这个用语也可以引申用来指说想法、意见或者行动上的不一致。我们可以用 out of step with 加上名词来表达说跟什么脱钩、脱节，跟什么格格不入。那么相反的 in step with 加上名词则是指与什么步调一致。好，那我们用 out of step 来造个例句。He's totally out of step with current fashion， 它跟现在的流行时尚完全脱节。好，那么第二个片语是要介绍 a step in the right direction， 字面上的意思是朝正确方向的一步，那么引申用来指迈向成功的一步。举例来说 Exercise won't make up for unhealthy eating habits, but it's a step in the right direction。 运动没办法弥补不健康的饮食习惯，但却是迈向健康的一步。好，那么以上见重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Erupt. In Syria, protests against the government soon erupted into civil war. Racial. Racial inequality still exists in many countries around the world. Murder. After several murders took place in their neighborhood, people were concerned for their safety. Monument. This monument honors those who died in World War II. Federal. In the United States, citizens must pay both federal and state taxes.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Okay, here's our discussion starter for today. Do you think people were right to protest over the killing of George Floyd?
Yes, I think people were right to protest because otherwise nothing would have gotten done. These people, they can protest. It is their right. And by protesting, these protesters really did bring about some good changes. No longer will police officers be able to get away with murder.
Well, I think the protests were legitimate. They should have occurred, but I think they went too far when they started to damage public property and when they started to tear down those statues. That should be done through some legal process. If people take the law into their own hands, then that means people on the far right or the far left can do that too, and then you're just going to have a big mess.
Okay, everyone. With that, today's article is now complete. But, as always, we sure hope that you guys have enjoyed reading along with us. Anyways, I'm Jeff.
I am Roger.
See you next time.